Back to today's video. Today is Thursday, June 6th, 2024, and today we're going to be talking about Donald Trump's Veep stakes, as the Trump campaign has reportedly asked for vetting records in his vice presidential search, as it seems to be intensifying as the list grows and grows and grows amongst those who are being actively considered as Donald Trump's vice presidential nominee in the 2024 presidential election. Now, to list these names off, I think is probably the best way to go about this. We've already talked very extensively about who Donald Trump might choose, why they might choose them, but ultimately it seems, based on sources close to former President Trump, that these are the people that are being actively considered. And honestly speaking, there aren't that many surprises, if there are any at all. And I think what we have found here is that Donald Trump ultimately is choosing from a list of candidates that was entirely predictable. And while that may be the point of investigative journalism and reporting on political decision-making and who might actually become vice president or the vice presidential nominee, depending on how the race ultimately goes, it's always an interesting, area where Donald Trump seems to be choosing the exact same people 6 months ago, prior to him winning this nomination, that we might have envisioned him with, based on some of the very early tendencies of Donald Trump to choose those in primaries of those who are most loyal to him, those who have been the most outspoken in favor of him, those who refuse to accept the results of the 2020 presidential election. A lot of these people here seem to be in heavy consideration, largely for things that, again, were predictable very early out. And so to give you a general idea, we can actually take a look at who they are, pretty much exploring, who they're not exploring, and talk about what decisions might have led up to the reasoning, why he's choosing somebody versus not, why somebody who might have been otherwise on the short list isn't this time around. And I think for a variety of different reasons, many different ways that we could go about this. Regardless of who it is, nothing is as set in stone until we actually get around the primary convention season. You're talking in a month from now, but this gives us a general idea of who Donald Trump is ultimately going to pick as vice president. And so, again, the Trump campaign rejects all of these reports that come out about the vice presidential search. It's the same thing we saw from the Clinton campaign when people were speculating the short list had narrowed down. Same thing we saw from the Biden campaign. This is standard discourse that you get from members of a political party campaign team who say, you know what, this is wrong, this isn't going to happen. These are the people that Donald Trump is actively considering, and we probably won't get anything out of left field because, arguably speaking, this election has been so predictable that these two-party nominees could have been handpicked and chosen 4 years ago, knowing the exact dynamic of that election. So that was a mouthful. Let's go ahead and actually start about who's being chosen, start taking a look at who's being actively considered for vice president here. And so we start off by taking a look amongst those who have received requests. This is from the Associated Press. This is how they're reporting on it. North Dakota Governor Doug Burgum. Now, this one I don't think is too surprising. He endorsed Donald Trump right away after dropping out, and also just generally has never really been that big of a critic of Donald Trump. When he was running for president, he was largely irrelevant and made a whole name for himself, but never really about slandering Donald Trump, going after Donald Trump. And I say this because we did find that some Republicans were, in fact, extremely critical. People like Nikki Haley, at times Ron DeSantis. And so arguments like those, I think, really started to make people question, would those people ever be considered for VP? And so Doug Burgum probably, in a smart way, took a look at it and said, you know what, I'm going to take a step back and I'm going to do this my way. And it seems to have paid off because he has now received a request to be vetted for vice president. It also includes Senator Marco Rubio, who actually was a very outspoken critic of Donald Trump in 2016, but obviously he has done more than enough to win his favor back as he is now being considered for vice president. Recently elected Senator J.D. Vance is amongst the short list here, seemingly someone who was elected in 2022, Donald Trump's hand-chosen nominee in that race here, so it makes sense that he would be thinking about somebody who he recently got elected, but very, very recently elected to the U.S. Senate. If experience is going to be at all a factor in this race, J.D. Vance certainly does not bring that. South Carolina Senator Tim Scott, this is probably the least surprising name I could have seen on this list. Makes a lot of sense. He's somebody who has been in active consideration, very publicly too, saying he would be honored to be the vice presidential choice for Donald Trump here. And so these four names, I really don't come in with any type of surprise, but it also starts to narrow down our field here with all this consideration. Is Donald Trump going to choose a woman? Is he going to do a whole, new dynamic flow of the race? Chances are, based off these top four picks, probably not. That also means now, too, he's considering Representative Byron Donalds. Now, I think this name really, jumps out to me as somebody who really is not a strong candidate for this list. I think Byron Donalds is probably one of the worst people you could choose when it comes down to the vice presidential nominee spot. And I think that's largely because Byron Donalds has made a name for himself but not in the most positive way. He is certainly seen as an extremist. He's seen as somebody who held up the House vote on the speakership. I really don't think Byron Donalds is the right way to go on this, and his most recent comments that have now been uplifted by members of the Biden campaign and other political party campaigns and down-ballot races, where he made an insinuation that things were better for Black Americans under the Jim Crow era. I don't think things like that will play well. And that's not to say that any of these other candidates don't have their own gaffes, but this was today. This was the news of today surrounding Byron Donalds, and so to see his name on the list, I think immediately I'm starting to see red flags. And when you talk about a vet, I certainly think that this would be raised up. Elise Stefanik, New York representative, I think she's amongst the stronger choices here for VP. And then you also have Dr. Ben Carson, who I think, honestly, is also very similarly a bad candidate. I don't think he's at all enthusiastic. I don't even think that he would add much to the ticket here. He had his whole hype in 2016, but, very much fell far from the Republican Party's grace. And I honestly do think, too, Ben Carson, as someone who was on the administration, I don't think that's a right choice either. The good thing about everybody else here is that none of them actually served in the Trump administration. Ben Carson, for better or for worse, would be seen as solely an extension of Donald Trump and really nothing more. I also think, too, Donald Trump needs somebody who is very combative. He needs somebody who matches his style of campaigning. I think balance is always nice in terms of electability, but there are people who are very, charismatic, people who are able to talk to voters, able to talk directly to media, talk to the screen, talk to anyone and everything. And that's what Donald Trump needs, because he's going to mess up on the campaign trail. And while Mike Pence might have offered what was right for 2016, when there was all these questions about presidential acts and, whether or not Donald Trump was stable enough to be the next president of the United States, and Mike Pence tempered that. The American public may very well know what they believe on Donald Trump's temperament or not is not going to matter to them this election. This is the third time that Donald Trump is up for a presidential bid, and so all of those 2016 talking points really do not contribute actively to a consideration about VP. And now that we've seen nearly this entire list, this is the extent of it. From Doug Burgum to Ben Carson, that is who we know from the Associated Press, from Politico, from those who are speaking very close from the Trump campaign. These are the people being selected for vice president. This is the list that Donald Trump is running with. I think there are certainly some people who stand out, but what's more important too, I think, just in the drama of it all, because that's what the Veep stakes have largely been for the past couple of months, is who has actually fallen off this list that was actively being considered before. And Donald Trump's own words at political fundraisers and on campaign stages, who he was considering for VP. And so the New York Times did this whole article way back in May, 2 weeks ago. I remember covering it, and it feels like it was way back when, but this election has really made everything seem so much longer than it actually is. We're 5 months to Election Day, guys. You're looking, 5 months to Election Day, November 5th. Less than that, actually, since it's the 6th. Very interesting. Regardless, let's go back to this. When we're taking a look at who Donald Trump was actively considering for VP, let's talk about who's not on this list. Marco Rubio is there. Tim Scott is there. Tom Cotton and Nikki Haley are off. A little bit more on Nikki Haley later. I think there were certainly some political miscalculations on her end, but also on Trump's end, especially with her not even getting vetting paperwork for this one. I know it was not the best look, and sure, some members of the Trump base were going to be upset, but a lot more independents will be much more happy with the Nikki Haley pick, but it looks like that just simply isn't going to happen. Elise Stefanik's on the list. Mike Pompeo is not. That makes sense, though. Again, I'm never a big fan, personally, of choosing an administration official to be your VP. That's just not the way it goes. Moving over to the Loyalists, too, J.D. Vance, Ben Carson, they're here. Very interesting. Sarah Huckabee Sanders was a no-go from the beginning, in my opinion. Seems like Donald Trump agrees. Rick Scott, too. You can't choose someone from your own home state. Amendment problems, can't do that. Not how it works here in America. Technically speaking, Trump could move. Probably would do it with Marco Rubio. I just think when you're talking about Rick Scott, when you're talking about Donald Trump, there isn't as much of a reason to do so. Marco Rubio certainly adds more. And again, we'll talk about that once we get through it. Kristi Noem, very, very, very notably taken off this list. I think especially following the release of her book, where she announced that she had killed her puppy, and somehow that made it through the eyes of many people, the eyes of those vetting the book, even her PR people. I don't know who made such an insane F-up, but I think ultimately that is why Kristi Noem is not on this list. We saw articles immediately after the book had been released that Donald Trump was no longer considering her. Fox News brought Kristi Noem on and said, "You used to be number one on my pick." A Fox News host said to Kristi Noem, "You were number one on my VP shortlist. Today, you are no longer even on it." How do you respond? She doubles down. She goes after Commander, Joe Biden's dog. This is not something you play with. The way that Americans feel about puppies and pets, it is just such a weird and number one political rule to not mess with things like this, to not go into any type of innocent animal life and try to make it out to be anything more than what it is. And I think that's exactly what Kristi Noem's problem was, and that she couldn't recognize that that was what was pushing her away from this VP spot. And clearly, Trump got the message and is sending it to her loud and clear. Now, Byron Donalds is on this list. Described as an up-and-comer, that is correct. Byron Donalds arguably has not been notable for a very long period of time. He served in Congress for just 2 terms here. And so for him to be actively considered for VP, this is a very big and upward trajectory type of ploy here from the Trump campaign. I don't think it's a smart choice. Wesley Hunt is not on the list. Nancy Mace is not on the list. I think there's a reason for that too. Her comments following the January 6th insurrection, where she said, we need to blame Donald Trump. He is responsible for this. I think that disqualified her from the beginning. Vivek Ramaswamy, we saw weeks ago, he was taken out of consideration, but being in consideration for a cabinet spot. And after what was arguably an abysmal State of the Union response from Senator Katie Britt, she also has been rescinded, it seems as if, from this final list here. And so here's where we're at. Again, Doug Burgum, Marco Rubio, J.D. Vance, Tim Scott, Byron Donalds, Elise Stefanik, and Ben Carson. And so now that we know this, I want to take a moment to reflect on that Nikki Haley point I wanted to talk to you about, where I believe she would have offered the most to the presidential ticket had she been chosen as VP. Because I genuinely do not believe it when there are people out there who say Trump would have lost support by choosing Nikki Haley, because there is no reality in which Donald Trump being at the top of the ticket, isn't enough to inspire that core base, even if Nikki Haley is on the bottom of the ticket. She is not going to be a hindrance, but rather an immense value add when you take a look at how she polls amongst independents, when you take a look at her favorability ratings, when you take a look too at the way she has positioned herself on key hot button issues. She has been able to win over voters on issues like abortion in a way that no other Republican has been able to, on issues like the economy, on the issues like international aid. I mean, there's a whole variety of things that Nikki Haley did correct in the primary season that made her so electable for the general, but not for the primary. And so I think that's a very interesting, dynamic that she would have added to the ticket, and I think it would have certainly added a lot. With that being said, with her no longer in consideration, if I'm putting it bluntly, I think none of these people really inspire me as someone who would look at it from, hopefully, a more independent view. I think Donald Trump, in choosing any of these names, does not bring out something dramatically new. I think the best person on this list here is either Tim Scott or Elise Stefanik. I think the comments that have been made by people like Marco Rubio in the past will be easily picked up by Democratic press and used against Donald Trump. I also think Doug Burgum is far from this awe-inspiring, strong debater, strong presence in the GOP. Donald Trump's shortlist is short for a reason. There aren't that many people that he could actively consider for VP that would be tremendous value adds. And not that Mike Pence is the reason Donald Trump won the election, but he balanced him in a way in an election where voters were looking for that type of balance. None of these people here add that a level of electability that is necessary for Donald Trump in this election should things go more poorly than they are right now. Donald Trump is in a strong point. Should things get worse is the better way to phrase it here. He might not have someone to rely on in a constituency that helps him. Because when you take a look at this list, just take a look at Humor Me for a moment. Where are these candidates coming from? Byron Donalds, Florida. Marco Rubio, Florida. Tim Scott, South Carolina. J.D. Vance, Ohio. Doug Burgum, North Dakota. Ben Carson, more a national figure than anything, not representing a state, not a governor, not a representative, not a senator. And then Elise Stefanik hails from safe blue New York. Where is the value add of any of these candidates? Florida is already going to Trump. Marco Rubio, Byron Donalds, y'all got it. Because that's how this state's going to go. Trump is going to win Florida with or without you. Again, Elise Stefanik, no shot that Trump is winning New York. Doug Burgum, okay, turn a Trump plus 30 state into Trump plus 40. Big whoop. Tim Scott, South Carolina went to Trump by 12. Okay, it'll go by 14. I'm just not seeing the tremendous value add of having any of these candidates on the ticket from the sake of electability. But I think the problem here for Donald Trump, and the big reason why he's neglecting candidates like Nikki Haley, who would undoubtedly add significantly more to the overall value of his ticket, is because he values loyalty and he values just general participation in what Donald Trump has maneuvered himself into in this election. Are you re-upping what Donald Trump is saying about the criminal trial? Are you going out there and saying that this is un-American, Senator Tim Scott? Is this what you're doing to win his favor? The Veep stakes have been going on for months. All of these candidates, including those who are not even on this eventual shortlist, have been auditioning from the very beginning. And that fundamentally is the problem. If anyone looks into the story of Vice President Mike Pence and how he was actually chosen for VP, you'd realize it's very different than what is happening here. What had happened was that Mike Pence, because of a problem with Donald Trump's plane in Indianapolis after a rally, invited Trump over to the Indiana governor's mansion and asked Trump, "Why should I be your vice president?" And in that moment, I think, combined with a number of factors, knowing who Mike Pence was as a person, more of a tempered, more presidential seeming, just generally speaking, a more calm and collected politician, a standard one who wasn't awe-inspiring on his own, but certainly provided balance that Trump needed on the ticket. He got that because Mike Pence wasn't somebody who was actively auditioning. Mike Pence voted for Ted Cruz in the Indiana primary, and we forget about that. Because it was at that point that, at that time it seemed, Mike Pence wasn't actively pursuing Trump's VP nod. Mike Pence wasn't actively trying to do everything he could to be in the favor of the eventual Republican nominee. And that's what made Mike Pence so good. For the rest of these people, they have conformed themselves to be Donald Trump figures in their respective lights. Marco Rubio is the Donald Trump of Florida, not Ron DeSantis, but Marco Rubio. Tim Scott, who used to come in as a more measured, more moderate conservative, now in South Carolina has embodied Donald Trump in the fullest sense. Elise Stefanik, who wasn't a major Trump Republican back in 2016, has since become a very big, staunch advocate for Donald Trump in every regard, one of the first representatives to endorse him in his re-election bid. All of these people have been playing the long game, which makes them uniquely unappealing to anyone outside of that Trump bubble. None of them provide a value add. And that's why I think that this VP nominee choice could very well be one of the most inconsequential in this election cycle or in any of the past few cycles. Because ultimately, Trump needs somebody that is not on this list. Nobody on this list here is bringing that election home for him. And honestly speaking, the only person who can really do that is Nikki Haley, and Donald Trump is not going to choose her as VP. And so I think at this point in time, the Trump campaign is in, surprisingly enough, despite having this campaign figured out for a year now, this nomination clinched arguably for months now. The fact is, there aren't enough strong candidates on the Republican side for Trump to have the right person for VP, the electable person for VP. And that's going to be his problem coming this November. Because they could be a reason, part of it all, they could be a reason he loses the election. Because they don't add what a traditional VP choice would. And that would be a problem should things get worse for Donald Trump overall. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch and then a playlist from my 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.